Recently, various forces have attempted to set up a defense and a resistance in the socio-political domain against the extreme forms in which the disorder of our age manifests itself. It is necessary to realize that this is a useless effort, even for the sake of merely demonstrative purposes, unless the disease is dealt with at its very roots. These roots, as far as the historical dimension is concerned, are to be found in the subversion introduced in Europe by the revolutions of 1789 and 1848. The disease must be recognized in all of its forms and degrees. Thus, the main task is to establish if there are still men willing to reject all the ideologies, political movements, and parties that, directly or indirectly, derive from those revolutionary ideas. That is, everything ranging from liberalism and democracy to Marxism and communism. As a positive counterpart, these men should be given an orientation and a solid foundation consisting of a broad view of life and a stern doctrine of the state. Strictly speaking, the watchword could then be counter-revolution. However, the revolutionary origins are by now remote and almost forgotten. The subversion has long since taken root, so much so as to appear obvious and natural in the majority of existing institutions. Thus, for all practical purposes, the formula of counter-revolution would make sense only if people were able to see clearly the last stages that the world's subversion is trying to cover up through revolutionary communism. Otherwise, another watchword is to be preferred, namely reaction. To adopt it and call oneself reactionary is a true test of courage. For quite some time, left-wing movements have made the term reaction synonymous with all kinds of iniquity and shame. They never miss an opportunity to thereby stigmatize all those who are not helpful to their cause and who do not go with the flow or do not follow what, according to them, is the course of history. While it is very natural for the left to employ this tactic, I find unnatural the sense of anguish that the term often induces in people, due to their lack of political, intellectual, and even physical courage. This lack of courage plagues even the representatives of the so-called right, or national conservatives, who as soon as they are labeled reactionaries protest, exculpate themselves, and try to show that they did not deserve the label. What is the right expected to do? While activists of the left are acting and carrying forward the process of world subversion, is a conservative supposed to refrain from reacting and rather to look on, cheer them on, and even help them along the way? Historically speaking, it is deplorable that a reaction has been absent, inadequate, or only half-hearted, lacking people, means, and adequate doctrines right at the same time when the disease was still at an embryonic stage and thus susceptible to be eliminated by immediate cauterization of its infectious hotbeds. Had that been the case, the European nations would have been spared untold calamities. What is needed, therefore, is a new radical front, with clear boundaries drawn between friends and foes. If the game is not over yet, the future does not belong to those who share in the hybrid and crumbling ideas predominant even in the groups that do not belong to the left, but rather to those who have the courage to espouse radicalism, namely the radicalism of the absolute negations or of majestic affirmations, to use expressions dear to Donoso Cortés. Naturally, the term reaction intrinsically possesses a slightly negative connotation. Those who react do not have the initiative of action. One reacts in a polemical or defensive way when confronted by something that has already been affirmed or done. Thus, it is necessary to specify that reaction does not consist in parrying the moves of the opponent without having anything possible to oppose him with. This misperception could be eliminated by associating the formula of reaction with that of conservative revolution, a formula in which a dynamic element is evident. In this context, revolution no longer signifies a violent overthrow of a legitimate established order, but rather an action aimed at eliminating a newly emerged disorder and at re-establishing a state of normalcy. Joseph de Maistre remarked that what is needed, more than a counter-revolution in a polemical and strict sense, is the opposite to a revolution, namely a positive action inspired by the origins. It is curious how words evolve. After all, revolution, according to its original Latin meaning, revolvere, referred to a motion that led again to the starting point, to the origins. Therefore, the revolutionary force of renewal that needs to be employed against the existing situation should be derived from the origins. However, if one wants to embrace the idea of conservatism, that is, a conservative revolution, it is necessary to proceed with caution. Considering the interpretation imposed by the left, the term conservative is as intimidating as the term reactionary. Obviously, it is necessary to first establish as exactly as possible what needs to be preserved. Today there is very little that deserves to be preserved, especially as far as social structures and political institutions are concerned. In the case of Italy, this is true almost without exception. To a lesser degree it was valid for England and France, and even less for the nations of Central Europe, in which vestiges of higher traditions continued to exist even on the plane of everyday life. In fact, the formula conservative revolution was chosen by German intellectuals immediately after World War I, even with very recent historical references. As far as everything else is concerned, we must acknowledge the reality of a situation that is an easy target for the polemics of the left, according to which conservatives are not the champions of ideas, but rather of the interests of a particular economic class, that is, the capitalist one, which organized itself politically in order to perpetuate, for its own advantage, what is alleged to be merely a regime of privileges and social injustices. Thus, it has become all too easy to lump together conservatives, reactionaries, capitalists, and bourgeoisie in this way. A faux target, to use a military term employed in artillery barrages, was successfully chosen. Moreover, the same tactic was employed at a time when the avant-garde of world subversion did not yet wave the flag of Marxism and communism, but instead were represented by liberalism and by constitutionalism. The efficacy of this tactic was due to the fact that yesterday's conservatives, not unlike the contemporary ones, even though the former were of an undeniably higher caliber, limited themselves to defending their socio-political positions and the material interests of a given class, of a given caste, instead of committing themselves to a stout defense of a higher right, dignity, and impersonal legacy of values, ideas, and principles. This was indeed their fundamental and most deplorable weakness. Today we have sunk to an even lower level. Therefore, the conservative idea to be defended must not only have no connection with the class that has replaced the fallen aristocracy and exclusively has the character of a mere economic class, that is, the capitalist bourgeoisie, but it must also be resolutely opposed to it. What needs to be preserved and defended in a revolutionary fashion is the general view of life and of the state that, being based on higher values and interests, definitely transcends the economic plane, and thus everything that can be defined in terms of economic classes. In regard to these values, what refers to concrete orientations, positive institutions, and historical situations is just a consequence. It is not the primary, but rather the secondary element. If things were set up in this way, by absolutely refusing to set foot in the field where the left trains its aim on the faux target, its polemics would be rendered totally ineffective. Moreover, what is needed is not to artificially and coercively perpetuate particular forms tied to the past, despite having exhausted their vital possibilities and being out of touch with the times. For the authentic revolutionary conservative, what really counts is to be faithful not to past forms and institutions, but rather to principles of which such forms and institutions have been particular expressions, adequate for a specific period of time and in a specific geographical area. And just as these particular expressions ought to be regarded as changeable and ephemeral in themselves, since they are connected to historical circumstances that are often unrepeatable, likewise the corresponding principles animating them have a value that is unaffected by such contingencies, as they enjoy a perennial actuality. New forms, corresponding in essence to the old ones, are liable to emerge from them as if from a seed. Thus, even as they eventually replace the old forms, even in a new revolutionary manner, what remains is a certain continuity amid the changing historical, social, economic, and cultural factors. In order to ensure this continuity while holding fast to the underlying principles, it is necessary to eventually throw away everything that needs to be discarded, instead of stiffening, panicking, or confusedly seeking new ideas when crises occur and times change. This is indeed the essence of the true conservative spirit. Therefore, conservative spirit and traditional spirit are one and the same thing. According to its true living meaning, tradition is neither servile conformity to what has been, nor a sluggish perpetuation of the past into the present. Tradition in its essence is something simultaneously metahistorical and dynamic. It is an overall ordering force in the service of principles that have the chrism of a superior legitimacy. We may even call them principles from above. This force acts through the generations in continuity of spirit and inspiration through institutions, laws, and social orders that may even display a remarkable variety and diversity. An analogous mistake to the one I have just condemned consists of identifying or in confusing the various formulations of a more or less distant past with the tradition itself. Methodologically, in the quest for reference points, a given historical form must be considered exclusively as the exemplification and more or less faithful application of certain principles. This is a perfectly legitimate procedure, comparable to what in mathematics is called the shift from the differential to the integral. In such a case, there is no anachronism or regression. Nothing has been turned into an idol or made absolute that was not already so, since this is the nature of principles. Otherwise, it would be like accusing of anachronism those who defend certain particular virtues of the soul merely because the latter are inspired by some person in the past, in whom those virtues were exhibited to a high degree. As Hegel himself said, it is a matter of recognizing in the apparitions of temporal and transitory things both the substance, which is immanent, and the eternal, which is actual. With this in mind, we can see the ultimate premises of two opposing attitudes. The axiom of the revolutionary conservative or revolutionary reactionary mentality is that the supreme values and the foundational principles of every healthy and normal institution are not liable to change and to becoming. Among these values we may find, for instance, the true state, the imperium, the auctoritas, hierarchy, justice, functional classes, and the primacy of the political element over the social and economic elements. In the domain of these values there is no history, and to think about them in historical terms is absurd. Such values and principles have an essentially normative character. In the public and political order they have the same dignity as, in private life, is typical of values and principles of absolute morality. They are imperative principles requiring a direct intrinsic acknowledgement. It is the capacity for such an acknowledgement that differentiates existentially a certain category of beings from another. These principles are not compromised by the fact that in various instances an individual, out of weakness or due to other reasons, was unable to actualize them or to even implement them partially at one point in his life rather than another. As long as such an individual does not give up inwardly, he will be acknowledged even in abjection and in desperation. The ideas to which I am referring have the same nature. Vico called them the natural laws of an eternal republic that varies in time and in different places. Even where these principles are objectified in a historical reality, they are not at all conditioned by it. They always point to a higher, meta-historical plane, which is their natural domain and where there is no change. The ideas that I call traditional must be thought of along these same lines.